Mm, okay. So yeah, I mean, if you have, some of this would probably be a bit of review. If you haven't, then yeah, they'll probably, well, some of it might still be review, because a lot of what we talk about in logic actually kind of reinforces what we talk about in English classes also. So if you've obviously taken English classes, so some of this might be review also. All right, so my talk for today is on a logical defense of the pro-life position. I figured it was an appropriate topic since we are dealing with a Ratio Christi group here, and I know that Ratio Christi groups like to delve into apologetics and things like that. So my talk today is actually going to take place in 4 parts, and I'm going to talk about what is a syllogism. I'm going to talk about the basic pro-life syllogism. Actually, I'm not going to cover the third thing, other pro-life arguments, because those are actually in the outline, and so you can actually read those. That's just kind of to whet your appetite. But the talk has been going a little bit long, so I think I'm going to just start eliminating that from the presentation portion, and just kind of leave that in the outline. I do provide some references at the end also. So if you want some, so if you read through those arguments, they sound interesting to you, you can go into the references and find the articles and books where you can actually learn more about them. So I'll talk about what is a syllogism, I'll talk about the basic pro-life syllogism, and then I'll talk about the various pro-choice arguments. So first of all, what is a syllogism? Well, we need to talk about what statements are, because the syllogism is made up of statements. A statement is a sentence with a truth value. In other words, a sentence that is either true or false. So I have various statements here. For example, all dogs go to heaven is what we call a categorical statement. If the 49ers beat the Packers, they will go to the Super Bowl. That's a hypothetical statement. And either you went to school or you played hooky. That's a disjunctive statement. All of these statements have truth values, which means that they're either true or false. Questions like, where's the beef? And I might actually be dating myself a little bit with this question. It is not a statement because it doesn't have a truth value. It can be answered with a statement that has a truth value, but the question itself does not. Close the door is a command, and commands do not have truth values. And nonsense statements also do not have truth values. A nonsense statement is something like, the number 7 tastes like chicken. It's just nonsense. It doesn't make any sense. So those do not have truth values. By the way, I do want to mention that because this is on Zoom, I'm really trying to keep this informal. So if you have any questions as we go along, feel free to chime in. You can turn your camera on, raise your hand, or just turn your mic on and pipe up with a question or something. I'm happy to answer any questions as we go along, but there will also be a time of Q&A at the end also. So you can also just save your questions until the end. We'll cover them in Q&A. Okay, so of those 3 types of statements I talked about, the categorical statements are going to be the one that really concerns the topic for today. So a categorical statement is a statement that affirms or denies something about its subject. So for example, all dogs are mammals is a categorical statement. It's a statement because it has a truth value, and it's categorical because it affirms something about the subject being dogs, and the thing that it affirms are that they are mammals. Now, categorical statements consist of a quantifier, a subject, a copula, and a predicate nominative. The quantifier being all. The quantifier just tells us how many of the thing we're dealing with. The subject is dogs, the subject being who or what the statement is about. The copula is just a form of the verb to be. So in this case, copula is are. And then the predicate nominative is mammals, the predicate being what is being stated about the subject, and nominative just essentially meaning that it's stated in the form of a noun. So so a categorical statement would not say all dogs are mammalian. They would say all dogs are mammals, because we want that predicate to be in the form of a noun. And the reason why, not really relevant to this talk, but it's because you can actually switch the subject and predicate. So you want both to be in the form of a noun. But again, that's a topic for a different day. So what is a syllogism then? A syllogism is made up of 3 statements, 2 premises that lead to a conclusion. So in this syllogism here on the PowerPoint, premise 1 is all dogs are mammals. premise 2 is all poodles are dogs. Therefore, the conclusion, all poodles are mammals. So all three of those are statements. This syllogism is made up of two statements, the first two premises, that lead to a conclusion, which is another statement. Now, each statement is made up of two terms, the subject and the predicate. Dogs and mammals for premise 1, premise 2, poodles and dogs, the conclusion, poodles and mammals. So there are three terms in a syllogism: the major term, the minor term, and the middle term. Now, the major term, and again, I'm going to go through all these in more detail too. So if you're kind of, you know, kind of, not understanding at the moment, we'll go through these in more detail to explain them. So, so the major term in this case is mammals, because it is the predicate of the conclusion, and it's also found in premise 1. So since the major term is found in premise 1, we call premise 1 the major premise. The minor term is poodles, because it's the subject of the conclusion, and since poodles, the minor term, appears in premise 2, we call premise 2 the minor premise. And then the last term in the syllogism is dogs. And because dogs appears in both premises, we call it the middle term. The middle term is just a term that connects both premises, because you have to connect both premises together in order to be able to draw a conclusion from them. So now these are the different types of categorical statements. Categorical statements are essentially made up of three types. We have universal affirmative, which is, for example, all dogs are mammals. It's universal because it deals with all dogs, and it's affirmative because it affirms something about all dogs. The particular affirmative, some dogs are mammals. That's particular because it is only talking about some dogs, not all dogs. And then singular affirmative, Fido is a mammal. We call it singular because it just deals with one individual. And so we call universal affirmative statements A statements and particular affirmative statements I statements. And the reason we do that is because the Latin term for affirmative, affirmo, which I have there in parentheses, contains the A and the I. So that's where they get the A and the I from. And so conversely, universal negative, these negative statements deny something about the subject. So the universal negative, no dogs are mammals, deals with all dogs and saying they are not mammals, so it's universal. The particular negative, some dogs are not mammals, it's particular because, again, just dealing with some dogs. And then Fido is not a mammal is singular negative. And the same way we get them for the affirmative statements, we derive the E and the O names for these statements because it comes from the Latin term for negative, which is nego. So we get the E and the O from that word as well. And it's worth noting that regarding singular statements, we, for the purpose of analyzing a syllogism, we always treat singular statements as universals. So instead of just saying Fido is a mammal, we would say all Fido is a mammal. It's a bit semantically clunky. It sounds kind of funny, but for the purpose of analyzing the syllogism, that's how we would do it. Okay, so a good argument must have clear terms and true premises. Now, it's important not to get these terms confused. Sometimes, if someone's not trained in logic, they might use some of these terms in a way that's kind of colloquial. Like, someone might say, "Oh, you make a valid argument," or "You make a valid point," or "That's very cogent." These kinds of things. But these terms do actually have actual meaning in logic. So when we talk about terms, your terms are either clear or unclear, and your premises are either true or false. So your terms cannot be true or false. Your argument can't be true or false. Your terms can only be clear or unclear. Your premises can't be clear or unclear. They can't be valid or invalid. They can only be true or false. And by the same token, your argument can only be valid or invalid, sound or unsound. It cannot be clear or unclear or true or false. So these terms are all reserved for the terms, the premises, and the argument, like it shows up here on the PowerPoint. So then to say that an argument then can either be valid or invalid and or sound or unsound, an argument is invalid if and only if the premises are true and the conclusion is false. So to determine validity, we assume all the premises are true, even if one or both are false, and then we see if the conclusion can be true or false, given the assumption that the premises are true. So a valid argument is an argument in which the conclusion follows necessarily from the premises, even if the premises are in fact false. Um, so an argument with false premises can still be logically valid. If the premises are true, then the conclusion cannot be false. So a sound argument is a valid argument with true premises. Now, that's a little bit of a mouthful, so we'll go over these concepts here in the PowerPoint. And this first argument is kind of the go-to argument that they talk about when they talk about philosophy and logic and syllogisms, those kinds of things. So we have this argument which says all men are mortal. Socrates was a man. Therefore, Socrates was mortal. Now, this argument is valid because if it's true that all men are mortal and Socrates was a man, then it must be true that Socrates was mortal. And we know that the premises are true. All men are mortal, and Socrates indeed was a man. And we know the conclusion is also true. Socrates was mortal because it follows necessarily from the two premises. So this is an argument that is both logically valid and logically sound. Excuse me. So now we can actually have an argument that is valid but unsound, and this is such an argument. Premise 1, all apples are fruits. Premise 2, all fruits are poisonous. Therefore, the conclusion, all apples are poisonous. Now, this argument is logically valid because if it's true that all apples are fruits and all fruits are poisonous, it must be true that all apples are poisonous. So the argument is valid because we assume the truth of the premises in order to see if the conclusion necessarily follows. So if we assume both premises are true, the conclusion must be true. So the argument is logically valid. But as we know, at least one of the premises is false. All fruits, not all fruits are poisonous. So this argument then is unsound because it has one premise which is false. And of course, that means that the conclusion also is false. All apples are poisonous. But it would be unsound even if it happened to lead to a true conclusion as well. Okay, now here's another invalid argument which takes a little more thought to see why it's invalid. So premise 1 says all people who own Ferraris are rich. Premise 2 says John is a Ferrari owner. Therefore, the conclusion is John is rich. But this is actually an invalid argument because the conclusion doesn't necessarily follow from the premises. It is possible for someone who is not rich to own a Ferrari. John may have won the car in a game show or inherited it from a rich uncle. So the argument is invalid because the conclusion doesn't follow necessarily from the premises. So because we've already determined the argument is invalid, we don't even have to try and determine if it's sound, because an invalid argument is automatically unsound. So we can see that there's a false premise and a false conclusion, but we don't even need to go that far because we've already determined the argument itself is invalid. And finally, another invalid argument. So premise 1 says all animals with feathers are birds. Premise 2 says some birds are flying animals. Therefore, the conclusion, all animals with feathers are flying animals. Now, this is an invalid argument because the premises are true, but the conclusion is false. We know that not all animals with feathers are flying animals. So even though the two premises are true, the conclusion is false because in a valid argument, you cannot have two true premises and a false conclusion. So this is another example of an invalid argument. So we don't even need to go on to see if it's sound or not. All right, so how do we determine if an argument is valid? Well, there are certain rules for validity. The rules essentially are, rule number 1, you cannot have more negative premises than you have negative conclusions. So there is only one conclusion, so you can only have at most one negative conclusion. So if your conclusion is affirmative, you cannot have any negative premises. If your conclusion is negative, you can have one negative premise and one affirmative premise. And so because there's only one conclusion, you cannot have two negative premises. So one of your premises must always be affirmative. And then rule number 2 really has to do with distribution of terms. And what that means is the term, it says statement there, but it should actually say term. The term refers to all members, or no, I guess that is correct. The statement refers to all members of the term's class. So there are a couple different things that go with this. So number 2 is the middle term must be distributed in at least one premise. And the other part of that is if the minor term is distributed in the conclusion, it must be distributed in the minor premise. And if the major term is distributed in the conclusion, it must be distributed in the major premise. And again, I'll show some examples of these so we can get a visual representation of this idea here. So here's really the distribution chart. If your statement is universal affirmative, for example, all dogs are mammals, the subject is distributed because you're dealing with all dogs, but the predicate is undistributed. You're not dealing with all mammals, you're only dealing with the set of mammals that are also dogs. Your negative statement, no dogs are mammals, both are distributed because you're dealing with all dogs and you're saying they're not mammals, and you're dealing with all mammals and saying they're not dogs. So the subject and predicate are distributed. And so for particular affirmative and particular negative, I put the distribution chart here to where they're actually diagonally related, because the universal affirmative and particular negative are the opposite when it comes to distribution. In universal affirmative, the subject is distributed, but the predicate undistributed. And in particular negative, the subject is undistributed and the predicate is distributed. In universal negative, subject and predicate are distributed. In particular affirmative, neither one are distributed. So they're both undistributed. So let's see. Yeah, okay. So essentially, whether a statement is distributed or not has to deal with whether or not you're dealing with all members of the class. So in this case, we're dealing with all dogs, so it's distributed. We are not dealing with all mammals, so it's undistributed. All right, so we're just about to the pro-life syllogism, so just hang tight with the informational aspect of this for just a few more minutes here. So in order to refute an argument, you must respond to the point. Latin for that is ad rem. Distracting from the main point of an argument results in a logical fallacy, which is an error in reasoning. So there are two overarching categories of logical fallacy. There are formal fallacies, which have to do with the form of the syllogism, and there are informal fallacies, which have to do with the content of the argument. Now, I've given a couple of examples up here. The fallacy of the undistributed middle is an example of a formal fallacy since it deals with the form of the syllogism. If neither premise distributes the middle term, then there's no necessary connection between the premises. So it is a formal logical fallacy not to distribute the middle term in at least one premise. And so then an example of an informal logical fallacy is ad hominem. And ad hominem, in this case, the error is not with the form of the argument itself, but with the content of the argument. So for example, you're dismissing a person's argument based on an irrelevant characteristic of that person's character. Okay, so I should probably turn my phone off. Okay, so congratulations, you've just been given a semester's worth of logical training in about 20 minutes or so. So don't you feel happy? All right. But all of that is very important because now we can actually talk about the pro-life syllogism. If you've listened to Scott Klusendorf talk, you've most definitely heard the term syllogism because he likes to kind of, okay, I got thumbs up from Stephen Carr there. He definitely likes to hammer home the concept of the syllogism. Well, this is kind of a more fundamental reason for why it's so important to focus on this syllogism. So I've just given you the basic tools to understand how to analyze a syllogism. So I've given the basic pro-life syllogism here. This is the syllogism that pro-life speakers and arguers use. And so I'm going to show how the argument is valid and sound, and then I'm going to show why pro-choice arguments don't do the job that they should do, that they don't actually address the argument, they actually argue irrelevantly and commit fallacies. So this is the basic pro-life syllogism. Premise one is all acts that intentionally kill an innocent human being are wrong. Premise two, all abortion is an act that intentionally kills an innocent human being. Therefore, all abortion is wrong. Now, a couple of clarifications here. Saying all abortion is wrong is not necessarily to imply that all acts of abortion are necessarily wrong. Most pro-life people believe an abortion to save the mother's life is permissible so long as the death of the fetus is foreseen but unintended, and the act to save the mother's life is not directly responsible for the death of the fetus. Rather, saying abortion is an act that intentionally kills an innocent human being is a singular statement. So for the purpose of the argument, we treat it as a universal. So even though it's semantically clunky, we add the all in front of it to treat the singular statement as a universal one for the purpose of analyzing the argument. So as we can see, this argument here is made up of three universal affirmative statements: the first premise, second premise, and the conclusion. So the first step in arguing that the argument is a good one is we have to defend the argument's validity. Because once again, if the argument is invalid, you can just reject it right off the bat. So we need to make sure we know that the argument is valid. So again, a good argument needs to have clear terms. In this case, the terms are clear. Abortion is an act that ends a woman's pregnancy by killing the fetus. An act that intentionally kills an innocent human being is an act in which someone acts with intention toward ending an innocent human being's life. And innocent, in the case of this argument, just means the fetus has not committed an act deserving of death. Merely existing in the womb does not carry a death penalty. And of course, the word wrong just means immoral. So the terms are clear. Now the conclusion is affirmative, and both premises are affirmative. So we also passed the sniff test regarding affirmative and negative premises. We have our conclusion is affirmative, so both of our premises must be affirmative. In this case, they are. Now the middle term, which is acts that intentionally kill an innocent human being, is distributed in the major premise. Now that's kind of a long term, but again, a term can be any length. It's just something that's between the various parts of the statement. So so the term acts as the subject or the predicate of the statement. So in this case, acts that intentionally kill an innocent human being is our middle term. And as we can see in premise one, that term is distributed because we're dealing with all acts that intentionally kill an innocent human being. So the middle term is distributed in the first premise. We're good there because the middle term must be distributed in at least one. And then the minor term, abortion, is distributed in the conclusion. And as we can see, it's also distributed in the second premise, in the minor premise. So it's distributed there. The major term is not distributed in the conclusion, so it doesn't have to be distributed in the major premise. So the minor term is distributed in the conclusion, the second premise, and the second premise. So we're good there. The argument passes all of the criteria for a valid argument, so the argument is logically valid. Now, logically valid is not really up for debate. Logically valid is something that you can tell and test objectively. As long as it passes the criteria for being a valid argument, it's logically valid. Even if it's an argument you don't like, or maybe it's a conclusion you don't think is true. Either way, it can still be logically valid, and there are objective reasons for believing so. So a pro-choice person shouldn't necessarily get upset at you for saying that your argument is logically valid, because that's not really what makes an argument succeed or not. What really matters is whether or not the argument is sound. So we've shown that the argument is logically valid. Now to show that it's sound, we need to present a case that the premises are true. So to defend premise one, which is all acts that intentionally kill an innocent human being are wrong, we can simply say that really it should be self-evident. All of us really believe that it's wrong to intentionally kill an innocent human being. It's not really something that we should have to present an argument for. It's just something we all kind of know. So it seems to be supported by intuition or by experience. But sometimes intuition isn't a good enough reason for some people. So we can take it a little bit further. We can say that all societies, or at least civilized societies, have established laws against taking human life without strong justification, even if those societies have disagreed over what constitutes strong enough justification. And the third reason we can present is that it's wrong to take a human life except in the most exceptional of cases. For example, self-defense, capital punishment, just war. And A couple of those might be controversial, but that's not really the point. The point here is that none of those deal with innocent human beings. So this is because all human beings have a right to life, which I am obligated to respect if I want my own right to life respected. A proper respect for human life and dignity requires that I treat others in a way that contributes to their flourishing, or at least does not hinder their ability to flourish as humans ought to flourish. So these arguments, I believe, strongly support premise one. So premise one has been defended. But what about premise two, the premise that all abortion is an act that intentionally kills an innocent human being? Well, some of the defenses I would offer for that are essential. Number one, embryologists consistently agree human life begins at fertilization. In fact, a colleague, Steve Jacobs, recently published a study in which he shows that 96% of biologists agree that human life begins at fertilization. So essentially, we have a scientific consensus that human life begins at fertilization. So there's that scientific consensus that we have, but we can also show that the unborn entity is a living, human, independent organism. We know that the unborn individual from fertilization exhibits the properties of living things. It grows through cellular reproduction. It responds to stimuli. It metabolizes food for energy. It maintains homeostasis, etc. So we know that it's a living thing. We also know that it's genetically human. It's produced by human parents, and it has a unique human genetic code. So it's alive and it's human. We also know that it's an individual. It may be connected to the woman's body by the umbilical cord, but the umbilical cord transfers nutrients and oxygen to the fetus, but it does not direct its development. Development is performed by the embryo herself. And then finally, we know it's an organism. It's developing itself from within into a more mature version of itself. There's no fundamental change at any point in the embryo's existence that turns it from one thing into another thing. It will continue to grow and develop until it dies. So if the unborn entity from fertilization, as I've just made a case for, is a living human independent organism, then abortion does result in a human organism's death. And now this is a point that's not even really challenged among academics in bioethics. They generally accept the scientific evidence that the unborn individual is a human being from fertilization. Now, most philosophers tend to lean pro-choice because they justify abortion through some other means. They don't justify it by trying to deny the biological humanity of the embryo or fetus. But I will get to some of those here shortly. So premise two, then, I would say, has been defended as well. All abortion is an act that intentionally kills an innocent human being. So the argument is logically valid. It has true premises, so the conclusion follows necessarily. The argument has been shown to be logically valid, and if my arguments for the premises are correct, logically sound as well. Okay, so I do have a few other pro-life arguments in the outline, and I really would encourage you to check those out because there are a number of very strong arguments for the pro-life position. The one I'm defending here, I believe, is sound and works to oppose abortion, but it's kind of a basic argument. It's not really going into much of the philosophy behind it, and these are some more sophisticated philosophical arguments. All right, so we'll go ahead and move on now to the pro-choice arguments. Now, pro-choice arguments really come in different varieties, and there are some that I'm even not going to address here because in a 1 hour presentation, it's not really possible to exhaustively examine every single argument used in the debate. So this is not an exhaustive list. This is more a list of arguments that you're most likely to hear. Like if you go to a college campus or if you talk about this with your friends and families, these are some of the arguments that you're most likely to hear. So these are the ones that I really want to help you prepare for by going over these. So now remember the pro-life syllogism that I gave you. That syllogism proves that abortion is immoral if the premises are true. So in order to reject the argument that I presented, the pro-choice person has to give us some reason for either denying premise one or denying premise two. So this first type of argument that I want to draw your attention to is the ad hominem fallacy. I mentioned this briefly before, but now I'm going to get into some specific ways that pro-choice people use the ad hominem fallacy against pro-life people. Now, ad hominem is Latin for to the man. And so the idea behind the ad hominem fallacy is that people are not attacking your argument, they're attacking the arguer. They're attacking the character of the person making the argument rather than attacking the argument itself. So one of the most common types of ad hominem arguments you'll hear is, you're a man, so you should have no opinion on abortion. The second type is, you're not pro-life, you're just pro-birth. And then my personal favorite, you just want to control women's bodies. Now, we can offer some good responses to these arguments. If someone says, you're a man, so you should have no opinion, we could just respond the way Frank Beckwith responds. Well, you know, arguments don't have gender, people do. So respond to my argument. Or you can respond the way that Scott Klusendorf does. Well, how do you know I'm a man? The other person says, well, you have a deep voice. And he says, well, so does Joan Rivers. Yeah, that's not really really the way we would recommend responding to this, but that's one way you could go. Or, you know, you could also say, well, you know, I was once a fetus and I could have been legally killed. So I think that I am directly affected by abortion, or at least I was. Or you could say, you know, I don't have to be black or a plantation owner to oppose slavery, so I don't have to be a woman to oppose abortion. In fact, this kind of argument could even backfire on the pro-choice person, because you could actually argue that not being a woman actually gives men more objectivity on the issue, rather than women who are more emotionally connected to it. Now, that's an argument I would not argue, to be clear, but that's the way that the argument could backfire on the pro-choice person. So any one of these three arguments do have good responses to them to show why they're bad arguments. But if we're talking logically speaking, then all we really have to say is, you know, we could just assume these things for the sake of argument. Okay, yeah, I'm a man. Okay, suppose I'm just pro-birth, or, you know, suppose I really, really just want fetuses to be born and I don't care about them afterward. Or, you know, suppose I'm just some misogynist who wants to control women's bodies. You know, all of those could be true, but how does that affect my argument that abortion is wrong because it kills an innocent human being? Well, they don't. None of those arguments really get at the heart of the argument that I'm presenting. So each of these can be ignored and, you know, safely rejected. So these three commit the ad hominem fallacy. The second type of fallacy, or I guess the only type of fallacy the only other type of fallacy I'm going to address here, there are others, but again, you know, I don't want to keep you here for 5 or 6 hours, even though I would love to. I find this topic to be pretty fascinating and pretty interesting, but I know you all have lives and everything. So, so again, not an exhaustive list, but the next most common one you're liable to hear is the petitio principii fallacy, and I may not be pronouncing that correctly, but it's just the Latin term for begging the question. And you beg the question when you assume what you're trying to prove. If you kind of smuggle your conclusion into your premises, you're begging the question because you haven't actually defended what you're trying to prove. So some common pro-choice arguments that beg the question are, well, some women are too poor to afford a child, or the world is overpopulated, so we need abortion to survive, or the argument from fetal abnormality. What if the fetus is severely deformed and will not have a very good quality of life? Well, we can show that these are actually begging the question by using a technique that was developed by Stephen Schwartz and which was popularized by Scott Klusendorf. And it's called Trot Out the Toddler. And essentially, Trot Out the Toddler is just a technique to show someone that they've kind of gotten off topic, that they're not addressing the central question of what is the unborn, which is the question that I'm focusing on with my argument. So the technique is simply just to look at a toddler and say, does this argument the pro-choice person is presenting, would it work just as well to support killing a toddler as it would to killing a fetus? If that's the case, then we can see that they're assuming the fetus is not a human being rather than arguing for it. So for example, some women are too poor to afford a child. Well, can we kill a toddler if his parents can't afford to continue caring for him? Well, No, of course not. So we can't use poverty as an excuse to kill the unborn. She could give birth to the child and then adopt the child out to a loving family who could afford to care for the child. So poverty is not a good reason to allow killing somebody. What about overpopulation? Well, would it be permissible to round up all the toddlers in the world and kill them to curb overpopulation? Well, no, obviously that wouldn't be acceptable. So assuming the world really is overpopulated, we can't use that as a justification for abortion. And what about fetal abnormality? Well, again, can we kill toddlers who are physically deformed to save them future suffering? Well, no, we can't do that. So it's not permissible to kill fetuses either. Now, the fetal abnormality is part of what's called the hard cases um, for abortion, and essentially these are cases that pro-life people have to kind of struggle against because of the implications of our views. And one of these being that we have to support birth in the case of a fetus that's severely deformed, and where the child is not going to have a very good quality of life. But that's what our argument leads to. Another one is the case of rape, which is what you're liable to hear whenever you talk about the case of abortion, because pro-choice people will usually find the most absurd case and bring it up. And so oftentimes you'll hear someone who's just kind of a crusader and wants to just come up with the worst case they can think of and say, you would actually tell this woman to have this child. And the problem with that, of course, is that these are exceptions. It's very, very rare for a woman to have an abortion in the case of rape. Most abortions are done for socioeconomic reasons. Now, that's not to say that rape is not an important question. Of course it is. But these are exceptions. And so we can't just look at the case of rape and say, okay, if we support abortion in that case, we should support abortion in all cases. Because obviously the vast majority of cases are not dealing with a situation in which a woman didn't choose to have sex. Most situations she did choose. So even if we accepted abortion in the case of rape, it's not something we can use to justify all abortions. But what about the case of rape? Because it is an important question. It's something we have to answer. Now, it does technically beg the question, because obviously we can't justify killing a toddler who was conceived in the case of rape. We couldn't kill the toddler in that situation. But if someone brings that up, especially someone who knows someone has been raped, or maybe they've been raped themselves, that kind of question, or that kind of response, is not going to be very satisfying. In fact, it might make you come across as unfeeling or uncaring. I'm sure as a Ratio Christi group, you've probably heard some philosophers talk about the problem of evil. And if someone brings up the emotional problem of evil, you don't want to respond with arguments against the logical problem of evil, because that's not what their concern is grounded in. And it's a similar case here. So when we talk about the situation of rape, we can talk about the intellectual case that, it's not permissible to kill an innocent human being. Children / fetuses conceived in rape are innocent human beings, so it is not permissible to kill them either. But we also have to remember that there's a second person who is also involved in the rape, and that's the woman who has had a very serious crime committed against her. And so we ought to lock up rapists and punish them to the fullest extent of the law. But the problem is that giving the woman an abortion after she's been raped will not help the woman's trauma. In fact, it will just compound one act of violence on top of another. And some women who've been raped have actually felt like the abortion was worse because it's an act of violence that they actually signed off on, whereas the rape was not something that they signed off on. So giving a woman an abortion in the case of rape is not necessarily the best thing for her. So we can actually make a case that the abortion in that case is not the best thing for her, on top of making the case that it's not permissible to kill the fetus in the case of rape either. So a woman who's been raped needs to be referred for proper counseling. And of course, there's much more to say on that as well. Each one of these topics could probably be given its own talk, but that's in a nutshell kind of how I would respond to that. So moving on here from the fallacious arguments, now we're getting to arguments that kind of more directly address the argument. So bodily rights, there are there are a few different kinds of bodily rights arguments. Some are really bad. Like if a pro-choice person says the fetus is just a part of the woman's body, and they mean literally a part, like one of her appendages or her kidney or something, that's a really bad argument. And the scientific arguments I gave address that. But there are two more compelling arguments, and Trent Horn is usually the one that we talk about as being responsible for kind of making this distinction between the two. So the first kind of bodily rights argument is the sovereign zone argument, which is essentially I can do whatever I want with anything in my body. So she treats her body kind of like a sovereign zone, you might say. She won't use those terms. Those aren't something that we hear, but that's kind of the idea behind it. And so this argument then would actually address the first argument of the pro-life syllogism, which is that all acts that intentionally kill an innocent human being are wrong. In this case, the pro-choice person would say, well, it's not wrong because I have the right to do whatever I want with anything in my body. So this one actually does get at the heart of the syllogism. So we can offer some responses to this sovereign zone idea. For one thing, the sovereign zone argument would justify all abortions, including sex selection and frivolous abortions. But studies have shown that most pro-choice people don't believe in unrestricted abortions. They don't believe, for the most part, in late-term abortions. They don't believe in sex-selective abortions or frivolous abortions. An abortion, for example, because she wants to fly overseas or she wants to go to a theme park and ride the rides. Most pro-choice people would not sign off on those kinds of abortions. So right away, we can oppose the sovereign zone argument there. But you might encounter people who kind of bite the bullet and do support all abortions. In fact, the workers for Planned Parenthood seem to really, really believe in all abortions, as do most Democratic politicians. In fact, they've gone a little further into supporting infanticide in some cases. So there are people out there who will justify all abortions. So we can use a couple of counterexamples to show that this idea still doesn't succeed. Some of you may have heard of thalidomide, which is a cancer treatment drug that was used during the 50s and 60s. And it was discovered that it could be used to treat morning sickness in pregnant women. But a couple of decades later, it was taken off the market because it was found that thalidomide actually severely deforms fetuses. It would cause them to be born without arms and legs. So the question is, if a woman could obtain thalidomide on the black market to curb her morning sickness, does she have the moral right to do that, knowing that it will deform her child, essentially? Does she have the right to take it to curb the morning sickness? If the sovereign zone idea succeeds, then yes, she has that right. But I think most of us would understand that there are some sacrifices we have to make, especially if it's going to cause severe harm to another human being. And if they bite this bullet, we can take it a little further, saying, okay, would she have the moral right to take thalidomide to intentionally deform the fetus? Suppose she took thalidomide and wound up deforming her first child and really loves the accolades and all the well wishes and people saying, oh, you're so brave raising a special needs child, that she wants to go through it again. And this time she takes thalidomide to intentionally deform her second child. Is that something that is permissible morally? And so, most people should say, well, no, that's not okay. It occasionally gets to the point where someone you're talking to is just trying to guard intellectual turf and will really just, dig his heels in and just kind of agree with anything you say. Those kind of people, keep them far away from children. Other than that, if they have a functioning conscience, they should say, no, it's not okay to intentionally deform the fetus, especially if it's a fetus she intends to give birth to. I can't imagine there are very many pro-choice people who would deny it's okay, who would deny that it is wrong to intentionally deform a fetus she intends to give birth to. Okay, so bodily rights is the better of these two arguments. The right to refuse is the better of the two bodily rights arguments. And this argument essentially says, I should not be forced to remain plugged in as life support to another human being, even to my own child. And this idea stretches back to the 1972 article written by Judith Jarvis Thompson with her famous violinist. If you haven't heard that one, in a nutshell, you wake up one morning and you're back to back in a hospital bed with a famous unconscious violinist. You try to get up, but you can't because you realize that you're connected at the kidneys to this violinist. The hospital curator runs in, explains the situation, that this violinist is dying from a severe kidney ailment. The Society of Music Lovers has canvassed all possible donors and found you're the only match. And so they kidnapped you and plugged you into this violinist. Now, I'd love to unplug you, but I can't because that would kill the violinist, and violinists are people too. So Thompson is really trying to make this scenario like the violinist, or like pregnancy rather. And this kind of argument actually addresses premise 2 of the pro-life argument, because premise 2 of our argument is abortion is an act that intentionally kills an innocent human being. But someone who makes this right to refuse argument would say, well, the intention here isn't to kill the fetus. The intention is to unplug from the fetus, like you could unplug from a famous unconscious violinist. So this argument does try to get at the heart of the pro-life syllogism also. But just like with the sovereign zone argument, this argument doesn't work for several reasons. In fact, I've written whole articles on and so have other pro-life writers and thinkers. There are a number of disanalogies between the violinist and pregnancy. But I've really just included probably the three biggest disanalogies here to show that this analogy does not really represent pregnancy. So the first one is that parents have special obligations to their offspring that they don't have for strangers. One of the things about Thompson's analogy is it really relies on the idea that parents have no special obligations to their offspring, that the only obligations they have are ones that are chosen. But this idea is just untenable. Children come into the world, naturally helpless and needy, and who else should be responsible for that child but their own parent? That's the way. If you're religious, that's the way God established it. But if you're not religious, that's the way nature adapted procreation to happen, and that's because evolution is geared towards survival. And so in order for us to survive, the parents have to be responsible for the children, and that way our genes get to be passed on, those kinds of things. So there's really no reason to deny that parents have special obligations to their offspring, but that's really one of the major assumptions of Thompson's argument, is that parents don't have obligations to their offspring by nature. And I think that's a very, very, very wrong. Nothing more I can really say about that. Another disanalogy is that abortion directly and intentionally kills an innocent human being, but unplugging allows nature to take its course. So if you're in the situation of the violinist, unplugging from the violinist allows nature to take its course, and the violinist dies from the kidney ailment. He does not die, or at least does not directly die, because you unplug from him. But abortion is not simply an act of unplugging. Abortion is an act of directly and intentionally killing the human being. The intention is for the human being to die, because the human being must die in order for you to be able to unplug from him. So there's no real way to get around that you're intending the death of the fetus, because that's the only way the fetus can actually be unplugged. And then finally, the woman is responsible for the child's existence in a state of dependency upon her. So you are not responsible for the situation the violinist finds himself in. But in the vast majority of cases, the woman and the man she has sex with, of course, is not only responsible for the existence of the child, but is also responsible for placing that child in a state of dependence upon her. So since she's responsible for that child's dependence, she is also responsible for giving that child basic care. And the final type of pro-choice argument we're going to look at here are arguments from functionalism. These are essentially the arguments that say, the fetus isn't a person, doesn't have any rights, because it lacks some function, some property that we have as adults that ground our rights. And so some of these are desires. David Boonin argues this. He says, if you don't desire something, then you're not harmed by being deprived of it. Another functionalist argument might be consciousness or self-awareness. This is one that Michael Tooley and Peter Singer would make, that in order for you to have rights and to have a right to something, you have to be able to basically see yourself as existing through time. If you don't, then you're not really harmed by being deprived of something, because you can't really see yourself as being deprived of that thing. And then, of course, there's sentience, which is an argument made by Wayne Sumner and Kate Greasley. This is the idea that capacity to feel pain is what's important. If you can't feel pain, it's not seriously wrong to kill you. If you can feel pain, then it is seriously wrong to kill you. And so he would say that, it's just as wrong to kill, an adult, giraffe as it is to kill an adult human being. But just like it's not seriously wrong to kill a fly because they can't feel pain, it's not seriously wrong to kill a fetus because it can't feel pain either. So there are ways to respond to each of these individually, but really all three of these come down to a few issues that they have in common. Number one is the episodic problem, that these could lead to losing your personhood and then regaining your personhood through life events. So, for example, when you fall asleep, you no longer have desires and you're no longer conscious or self-aware. If you go under general anesthesia before surgery, you no longer have desires, you're no longer conscious or self-aware, and you can no longer feel pain. That's the whole point of anesthesia, so you can make it through a surgery. So all of these kind of have the episodic problem that you would cease to be a person when you cease being able to perform these functions, and then you would regain your personhood whenever you're able to regain them. So, but obviously we don't want to say that you lose these functions, when a doctor's about to operate on you, because then that would justify the doctor killing you while you're in that anesthetized state. So obviously these are not things that we want to believe, and they're just not reflective of reality. Now, some of these prove too little by making killing animals as morally wrong as killing humans, or they prove too much by justifying infanticide. An infant does not have a desire for life like a fetus doesn't. So if you're going to argue your desires are what matters, then you would have to say that it's also permissible to kill infants, and infants are also not self-aware in the same way that that we are. And for the same reason it's wrong to kill fetuses, it would also be, or it's permissible to kill fetuses because they're not self-aware. It would also be permissible to kill infants, and this is actually the position of many pro-choice philosophers, such as Tooley or Singer, which I mentioned earlier. They would support infanticide because the infant is not self-aware. And finally, probably the most important, that these kinds of arguments confuse being a person with acting as a person. Now, being conscious and being self-aware do not make you a person. You are conscious and you are self-aware because you're a person. In the same way that you have to exist as a human before you can develop human parts, you have to exist as a person before you can develop personal properties like consciousness and self-awareness. So it's not that you just suddenly wink into existence when the fetus that you come from becomes self-aware. That doesn't even really make logical sense, because the fetus exists before the time at which it becomes self-aware, and it's the fetus that becomes self-aware. It's not that you didn't exist prior to that, and then you suddenly come to inhabit the fetus's body. I mean, the only real way to make sense of that is if you believe, in the pre-existence of the soul or something, which is not something I believe. It's not an Orthodox Christian position, and certainly an atheist would not believe that because they don't believe in the soul. So there's really no sensical way to make sense of the idea that these properties are what make you a person. So so those are essentially the pro-choice arguments. And again, these are not really the last word in any of these, because if I was talking to a philosopher, he would have rejoinders to my arguments, and then I could respond to those as well. So this is certainly not the last word on these. And, the academic literature on abortion specifically is pretty vast. But these, I think the arguments that I presented here will go a long way toward basically preparing you for any sort of argument you may come across from someone that you'll encounter in your regular life. You're most likely not going to encounter an academic philosopher while you're out doing pro-life, or while you're out doing pro-life outreach or something. I think these arguments will be good enough to show why the pro-life position is sound, because the premises are true in the argument, and if the premises are true, the conclusion necessarily follows. And so a good number of the pro-choice arguments do not address these arguments. They commit some sort of fallacy, ad hominem, or begging the question. And then the ones that do actually get at the pro-life argument, such as the sovereign zone and right to refuse argument, have compelling responses to them because they're grounded in ideas that don't reflect reality, especially the functionalist arguments. They just don't reflect reality, because we understand that just like an infant or a toddler does not have to be able to reason like I reason. We still recognize that that toddler has rights. It would still be wrong for me to kill the toddler. It would still be wrong for me to harm the toddler. It'd be wrong for me to steal his inheritance if I had access to it. We still recognize that it's wrong to harm people who don't think and act just like we do. So that's basically what I have here, and I would like to now open it up for Q&A if anyone has any questions.
This is the weekly meetings.
Oh.
Okay, I think I saw a hand from Steven.
If
Oh.
you mentioned sled yet?
We'll get after.
I'm sorry?
You mentioned sled yet?
Didn't go into SLED. I can if you would like me to.
Yes, please. I think it's important.
Okay. Yeah. So again, SLED is a different sort of argument. It's
Nice parking spot.
It's not an argument that defends the pro-life position. It's more of well, perhaps you as apologists have heard the difference between a positive argument and a negative argument. A positive argument is one that supports your view. A negative argument is one where you argue against a criticism of your view. So the SLED test is actually an argument, kind of a negative argument, one that we argue against certain arguments. And so SLED was actually developed by, I think it was developed by Stephen Schwartz. And so basically what SLED does is it's an acronym which shows that there are certain differences between a fetus and the adult that it later becomes, but none of these differences justify killing the fetus at its earlier point in life. And so these differences make up the acronym SLED. So it's size, level of development, environment, and degree of dependency. So first we can start with size. Well, we know that size is not something that grounds our value. Shorter people are not any less valuable than taller people. And we would not say that that women are less valuable than men just because they tend to be shorter than men are on average. So size is not something that grounds our value. So we can't just say that the fetus doesn't have value as a human being just because it's a lot smaller than we are. Then there's level of development. So fetuses, of course, are a lot less developed than we are. But again, so are toddlers less developed than we are. But we would not say that it's permissible to kill a toddler just because they're not as developed as adults are. So level of development is not an appropriate grounding of our value as human beings. The third one is environment. Yeah, fetuses are differently located than we are. They're in the womb, we're outside the womb, but a change in location does not change your nature. So it doesn't change your value. I'm going to be driving to New Mexico next week, but my nature as a human being is not going to change just because I make the journey from one state to another. And so a brief journey down the birth canal is not one that changes the nature of the fetus from something that's not human into something that is human. And the final one is degree of dependency. Degree of dependency says that, yeah, the fetus is more dependent than we are. But again, being more dependent does not, one state of dependency doesn't affect one's value. I'm able to drive myself various places, but, a young enough teenager has to rely on his parents to get him places. And so he's more dependent than I am as an independent adult. But we would not say that it's permissible to kill the teenager, even though some parents may want to. We would not say that it's permissible to kill the teenager just because they're more dependent than we are. And in fact, we generally understand that if someone is more dependent, that generally grounds more of an obligation for us to help. And we can use this from a thought experiment. The former director of Justice for All, a guy named David Lee, came up with this thought experiment to show this. He says, suppose you're swimming in a public pool, and you're drying off. You're about to leave. You think you're the last one out, but you suddenly hear a splash in the deep end. You look in, and a toddler has just fallen into the pool. Now you're the last one out, and so that toddler is completely dependent on you for its survival. Are you permitted to just walk away, or do you now have an obligation to jump in and save that child? Well, we would say that you have an obligation to jump in and save the child. So just because a woman is pregnant and she's the only one, and that fetus is completely dependent upon her for its survival, does not ground the permissibility of abortion. I mean, if anything, we generally understand that being more dependent grounds more of an obligation to help. So that's the sled test in a nutshell.
I had a question.
Yeah.
Okay, well, this is not really, okay. I thought your presentation was really well done, by the way.
Oh, thank you very much.
Some
Appreciate
really
that.
interesting points. Well, okay, since you did look at my presentation, I just wanted to know, like, is there anything that was, that I could have elaborated on more? Because, like, I just like to know for myself for better argument, like just better arguments in general.
Yeah, I don't really remember because I wasn't really looking at your presentation for feedback, just to kind of get an idea of where the students are at. If you want, I'd be happy to go back through it, give you some feedback on it, and I could send that to John, and he could send that over to you.
Cool, that would be really great. Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. Yeah, I'd be happy to do that.
What do you think the best response is to, I guess, someone who would want to say, if we grant the pro-lifer the force of their argument, then it would seem that the next thing that would result from that is for a woman who would take, for example, the morning after pill, we would legally be obligated to charge her with murder and send her to prison. And they would say, it seems like even if I can't put my finger on exactly where your argument is wrong, that seems like an over-exaggerated response to a woman taking the morning after pill. So does that show that there's something wrong with it, even if I can't quite put my finger on it? Or so what do you think our best response to that kind of legal point would be?
Yeah, so it can sometimes be the case where if you're not particularly trained in logic, you might come across an argument that you think is wrong, can't really quite put your finger on it. That's why it's important to get logical training. But if there's an argument that you can't quite put your finger on why you don't like it, just not liking an argument is not an argument against it. So if the argument is sound and you can't determine any sort of logical missteps, then we're intellectually obligated to accept the conclusion. So if someone is talking about that they think it's an over-exaggeration to throw someone in jail for taking the morning after pill, number one, this is another logical fallacy we can talk about called the appeal to consequences, that just because something has a consequence I don't like, that I'm going to reject the entire argument. Well, that's a fallacious way of arguing. But just talking about like logical fallacies the whole time, can kind of come across as kind of like, I don't know, pompous, or like you're just trying to lord your intelligence over the other person. So often, when we talk about fallacies, it's really helpful for us to remember that these are fallacies. But when we're actually having these discussions with other people, we don't necessarily want to name the fallacy. We want to just kind of walk them through and show them how why these arguments don't work, essentially. So when I say that this is an appeal to consequences fallacy, I'm not necessarily saying that's the way you should respond. I'm just saying this is kind of an idea for us to keep in mind, that they're arguing, this has a consequence I don't like, therefore I'm rejecting the whole argument. Well, that's not a good response to the argument. So if I were going to respond to someone who makes this kind of argument, I would probably concentrate on the discussion, which is an important discussion, about what the punishment ought to be for someone who has an abortion. Now, this is a question that's debated amongst pro-life people. There's no consensus among pro-life people about what the punishment ought to be. And really, the people most qualified to answer this question would probably be legislators, unless the pro-life person has really done his homework and really looked into what kinds of consequences certain actions should have. Because the thing is that, not all acts of abortion are necessarily acts of murder. Now, notice I haven't used the word murder once in this entire presentation, because acts of killing are not that clear cut, and they're not that black and white. So we can't necessarily say that a woman is murdering her child just by having an abortion. I would not say a woman who has an abortion because she was raped is committing an act of murder, necessarily, because, number one, in order to commit an act of murder, you have to be acting with malice aforethought. And a woman who is having an abortion because she's raped is not acting out of malice, even though she is having a homicide committed. I wouldn't necessarily call it an act of murder. So each act of abortion needs to be treated on a case-by-case basis. And when we're talking about the morning after pill, there's no solid evidence that shows that these contraceptions do in fact cause an early abortion. Now, they might. A lot of pro-life people will say that they do. A lot of pro-choice people would say that they don't. I don't think the evidence is secure enough for us to make that point. But if it ever got to that point, then yeah, I would say that I don't know if she deserves to be in jail. That's not necessarily for me to decide. That would be for the legislators to decide what kind of act it is. But I would say that if a woman acts in such a way that puts her child in danger, because like just using like a contraceptive, which could have a side effect of committing an early abortion, but usually is meant to prevent conception in and of itself. I don't necessarily think that's a malicious act, but it does seem to be a reckless act, because she's not necessarily intending to kill an embryo, but her killing an embryo resulted from her actions, so it would be an act of negligence. But again, there's also the case of, how would we ever really know that a woman actually committed an abortion by taking a morning after pill? Not necessarily sure there's any way to really be sure of that. And so, erring on the side of not wanting to lock up an innocent person in jail, I think needs to be considered as well. So the whole question about what consequences need to be considered is kind of a complex one, but it doesn't necessarily show that there shouldn't be consequences just because it's a complicated discussion. Does that help, or was I rambling a bit?
Yeah, no, that was good. I appreciate your answer.
Okay. Okay. Actually, I think I saw Steven's hand up earlier, and then I'll get right back to you, Hope.
Okay.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that if they reject the conclusion or the argument itself, when they have to object to either from P1 or P2.
Yeah, if someone wants to reject the pro-life argument, they have to object to either one of the premises. But they can't just object to it. They have to actually present a case for why they believe the premise is false and not true. So they can't just say, well, I object to your argument. I'm not going to accept it, because if my argument's true, they're intellectually obligated to object it or to accept it. And rejecting it would be irrational, because they're rejecting a conclusion that has a good logical foundation for it. Okay, Hope, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to know, so you brought up the point of like certain circumstances that pro-choicers bring up. And like you mentioned at one point, the case of when a mother, like most pro-lifers seem to be okay with an abortion in the case of, like, the mother's life is endangered, and then the fetus, or I'm sorry, the unborn doesn't really have a chance to survive. Well, I was just wondering, like, is that your stance, or were you just being objective in the presentation, or what is your stance on that? And Yeah.
So you're asking my stance on life-saving abortions?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. I mean, for the most part, I was just trying to be as objective as possible and explain all of the views here in the presentation. But me personally, I do believe abortion is permissible in certain life-saving situations. Now, this is also a debate among pro-life people because a lot of pro-life people don't like to consider life-saving abortions to be abortions. Because it's a life-saving procedure. They believe abortion has to be intentional, but the intention is not to kill the fetus; it's to save the woman's life. I view this as just a semantic argument. I don't think there's any difference here because the end result is still you're ending the pregnancy, with the end result being the death of the embryo or fetus. So, I still view these as abortions because I think they fit the clinical definition of what an abortion is. So when you hear a pro-life person say abortion is never permissible, they say abortion is never needed to save a woman's life. Well, that's just because they're defining the term abortion differently than most of us mean by abortion. So they mean the same thing that I do when I say life-saving abortions are permissible. They're just taking a more, a different definition of abortion. And so when I say that abortion is permissible to save a woman's life, I think there are a couple of justifications for this. That number one, in the case of a life-threatening abortion, we always want to in order to act ethically, we have to treat the embryo/fetus as a second patient. So we have to act in such a way that respects the humanity and the dignity of the embryo, as well as respecting the humanity and dignity of the pregnant woman. So we always have to act in a way that's ethical toward both, and so we need to treat both as a patient, essentially. So we can look at this as a case of triage. And when you have triage, you have two patients which are mortally wounded, and you have to act to save one of them. You want to save the one that has the best chance of survival. If you save the one that has the lowest chance of survival, you may end up losing them both. So in some cases of a life-threatening pregnancy, for example, ectopic pregnancy, which is a pregnancy where the embryo actually implants in the fallopian tube, not in the uterus, and so that can actually present a danger to the woman's life because the embryo grows large enough that the fallopian tube will rupture and she'll hemorrhage and most likely die. So that's a life-threatening situation regarding the pregnancy. So in that situation, I would say it would be permissible to act in such a way that the embryo dies and you save the woman's life. But there are certain criteria that we have to keep in mind in order to act ethically. And this is where the doctrine of double effect comes into view. Double effect says that there are two situations here at play, that any act we take has an evil effect. We can act to save the woman's life, but that results in the death of the embryo, which is evil. We can not act, in which case the woman is going to die, which is also evil. So if we want to act to have the best outcome, we can act as long as certain criteria are kept in mind. That number one, the act that we're performing is comparable to the evil that will happen if we don't act. In this case, we're saving the woman's life, which is comparable to the fact that she will die if we don't act. So the act is comparable. So the good end is comparable to the means by which we are going to resolve it. Another is that the death of the fetus or embryo cannot be intended, it must be merely foreseen. So in the case of a life-threatening pregnancy, the intention is not to kill the embryo, the intention is to save the woman's life. So if the doctor acts in such a way that the embryo ends up dying, the intention is not to kill the embryo, the intention is to save her life. And so another criterion that must be fulfilled is that the act that the doctor performs must not directly result in the death of the embryo. Because if he directly kills the embryo, then in that case, you're intentionally killing the embryo in order to save the woman's life. So you can't just say, you can't just kill the embryo and then say, well, I didn't intend to kill the embryo. I intended to save the woman's life. Well, because you did intend to kill the embryo because you directly acted in such a way that the embryo died. So when we look at, for example, an ectopic pregnancy, there are a few different ways you can resolve it. Number one would be by giving her a drug called methotrexate, which would cause the embryo to disconnect from her and the embryo would die. But that would be a direct act killing the embryo, because the act of prescribing the pill is what killed the embryo. So that would be a direct killing. That would be impermissible via double effect. Then there is a salpingectomy and a salpingostomy. Salpingostomy is where you cut a little hole in the fallopian tube, remove the embryo, and then patch up the fallopian tube. A salpingectomy is where you actually remove the portion of the fallopian tube from the woman's body. Now, the salpingostomy would be preferred because by the salpingectomy would actually lower the woman's future fertility by 50% because you're removing one of the fallopian tubes. But the question is a salpingostomy permissible? I myself believe it would not be, because it seems to me to be an act of direct killing to actually directly remove the embryo from the tube and place it in an environment in which it can't survive. So to my mind, salpingectomy would be the ethical way, because in that case, you're not directly killing the embryo, but the embryo will die as a result of your actions. Your direct action is removing the fallopian tube, which will result in the embryo's death. Again, the embryo's death is foreseen but not intended. Now, not all pro-life people agree with that. Christopher Kaiser, who's a pro-life philosopher, actually believes I believe he believes that salpingostomy would also be permissible. So even in this case, there's no real consensus among pro-life people, but there is a live debate about which way would be permissible to resolve that kind of a pregnancy. And then there are other situations we can think about, like if like a cancerous uterus, it would be permissible to remove the uterus, foreseeing that the fetus will die. But the death of the fetus is not intended and not directly caused by the doctor. And again, if the pregnancy is late enough, then no abortion would be permissible, because by that case, you can actually deliver the child so that the child can survive. And also, abortion would be a lot more difficult, and would take a lot longer than just giving her a C-section to deliver the child. So if the pregnancy is late enough, then an abortion is never permissible, because the child can just be delivered because he's viable at that time. And so that's, hopefully that's enough of a nutshell, but that's my general view on life-saving abortions.
No, yeah, that was great. I know that that's a common disagreement among pro-lifers, and I myself have gotten into debates about that. And okay, honestly, like my own personal view is, I don't know where I stand, honestly, with that kind of situation, because it's a difficult decision either way.
Right.
But I wanted to kind of understand the other viewpoint with that, because I know people that have that viewpoint.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, it's good that you're thinking through the issue, because it's definitely important, especially because there's no real consensus among pro-life people on this question. So.
Mm-hmm.
Clinton, this isn't a question specific on abortion, but do you have any recommendations for Christian bioethics books written specifically from a Christian perspective on bioethics that's kind of at the top of your list?
Yeah, I do. Let me see if I can remember the names off the top of my head. Otherwise, I could just pull them off my shelf. One is written by a guy named, and I'm going to butcher his last name. I'm not sure how to pronounce it. His name is Gilbert Meilaender, I think, Meilaender. So that's too many vowels to stick together in one person's name. So Gilbert Meilaender, however it's pronounced. He wrote a book called Bioethics, A Primer for Christians. And so that would be an excellent book. And then, let's see. Yeah, okay. I'm thinking I might get these two titles confused, but I believe his is called Bioethics, A Primer for Christians. And then the other one I would recommend is by Agneta Sutton. And her first name is spelled Agneta. Agneta Sutton. She wrote a book called Bioethics, A Guide for the Perplexed. and that's also geared toward Christians as well. So those two books, and I believe I've got those titles. You should be able to find them, even if I'm slightly off on the titles for those. But those definitely have my recommendation, especially as beginner texts for people who just want one geared specifically toward Christians, because those definitely fit the bill.
Yep. Thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah, Stephen.
Yes, I also have a recommendation too. Norman Geisler's Christian Ethics.
Okay.
Deals with higher ethics as well.
Yeah, I actually have not read that one. I have read some books by Norman Geisler, but for whatever reason, I just haven't gotten around to reading that one yet. Yeah, because I know Scott B. Ray has also written a good book on ethics. But again, it's more of a general ethics text, not specifically bioethics, but he does touch on those issues too. Did we lose John?
I think we lost John.
I'm here.
Oh, okay.
Anybody else?
Actually, I guess I can go ahead and stop sharing now because.
So if you don't have it, guys, I suggest you get The Case for Life by Scott Kusendorf.
Yes, definitely an excellent. That's actually a good introductory primer on the abortion issue itself. Yeah, in fact, I do have it listed under the resources as well.
How does that one compare? Because the one that I'm reading right now is this one, The Ethics of Abortion by the guy that you'd mentioned earlier.
Yeah, that one's in my resources too. Basically, if someone asks me for recommendations on the abortion issue, there are 4 books that I recommend. There used to be 3, so I used to call them the Holy Trinity of pro-life books, but there's 4 now, so I'm not sure. Holy Quadrinity, I guess. Number 1 is Scott Kusendorf's The Case for Life, because that's a very, very good introductory primer to the abortion issue. And actually, these are all in the resources too. So if you got the email from John, they'll be there too. But number 2 would be Persuasive Pro-Life by Trent Horn. That's really, he does go into some of the arguments, but that's really more of a conversational primer, like how to have good conversations with pro-choice people. So definitely a very good companion text to The Case for Life. Number 3 would be Defending Life by Francis J. Beckwith. And that's actually the book that first turned me on to the substance view argument against abortion. So if you look over the outline in the other pro-life arguments, I listed the substance view. That's Frank Beckwith's book, Defending Life, really talks about that. But Beckwith also talks about the legal aspect of Roe v. Wade as well. So you actually learn some about the whole legality around Roe v. Wade and kind of how that came about. And then number 4. Sorry. Okay, yeah, the number 4 would be the one that Isaac just held up, The Ethics of Abortion by Christopher Kaiser. And yeah, in case you're wondering, his last name is pronounced Kaiser. It rhymes with razor. I've actually had him pronounce it for me. So.
I like Beckwith's I drew a blank. Politically Incorrect Death.
Yeah. I have not read that one actually. That's actually kind of the prequel to Defending Life.
Yeah, it's more conversational and goes directly with the arguments. And
Yeah.
most of the arguments are all begging the question.
Right.
It comes down to it. So
yeah, and I think he even has a Socratic dialogue in the end on that one too.
he does.
Yeah, and actually, if, in the other pro-life arguments I have here, the first argument I have is the argument from identity, and I really think that's the strongest pro-life argument. It's the one I like the best as far as defending the pro-life position. That one was constructed by Alexander Pruss, who is also in the resources, and yeah.
There's also I can't think of the name of it, but it's Randy Alcorn's. I think it's Pro-Life Answers Pro-Choice Arguments.
Yeah, that's actually the first pro-life book I ever read. I definitely think it's good, with a caveat in that a lot of the answers are good, but he relies on a lot of statistics and things like that, and as the years go on, they become more and more out of date. So I really keep hoping he's going to update it at some point with more modern statistics, because that'll keep the book relevant.
I think the biggest thing
Go ahead.
is we were talking about Clinton before everyone got on, is just to memorize, if nothing else, memorize a few answers or arguments, and you're going to know more than most of the people who have a conversation with. Like he said, you're typically not going to run up on an academic philosopher that's pro-life or pro-choice.
Yeah.
And I know that's kind of stereotypical or kind of just basic, I guess, because a lot of people do apologetics that way. They just memorize like the minimal facts, and that's all they do.
Yeah.
Okay, fine. At least you'll have an answer other than, I don't know, or I feel it in my heart.
Right. Yeah. Right.
Also,
Yeah.
Another good introduction was Scott Klusendorf's Pro-Life 101, I think it is.
Yeah, I haven't read that one either, so I couldn't tell you anything about it. But
I've got to figure out who this Scott Klusendorf guy is, especially since Stephen called me out on it.
oh,
Publicly.
yeah, he's kind of the number one pro-life speaker and arguer that we have. Number one debater. Number two would be Josh Brahm of the Equal Rights Institute, and I'm somewhere. I'm like really low on the totem pole as far as professional speakers go. Because I have the quality of Scott Klusendorf and Josh Brahm, but as long as Scott and Josh are around, like they'll always be the first ones called in to give talks. So
how do you get involved in LTI?
A little bit of a long story, just kind of in a nutshell. I had been publishing articles on my own personal blog, and I started, and then I got in touch. Josh, actually, who was my pro-life mentor when I first started in the movement, he kind of put me in touch with Kelsey Hazard of Secular Pro-Life, and I got involved with the project from them. And they had a blog, and she had started publishing some of the articles I'd written, and some of those articles had started getting the attention of some of the more nationally well-known blogs like Life News, Life Site News, National Pro-Life Committee, etc. And so Scott actually just kind of became aware of me through the articles that I'd been publishing on these sites. And he just kind of sent me a Facebook message out of the blue one day and said, "Hey, are you involved with any pro-life organizations?" And I said, "Well, no." And he said, "Would you like to work for LTI?" And that's kind of how it happened.
Yeah.
Well, I'm afraid I'm going to have to leave, but it was really nice meeting you. Great presentation, and I'll see you all again.
Yeah, thanks very much. Take care. And yeah, I'll look over your presentation and get that to John for you.
Okay, that'd be great. Thank you so much.
Yep, you're welcome.
Bye.
Bye.
Anybody else have anything?
Just real quick, in your own experience, do you use any scripture for a basis of reference, or do you find that to be largely unhelpful?
It really depends on who I'm talking to. I generally tend to focus on science and philosophy because everyone, for the most part, I guess I should say, occasionally you'll encounter some, atheists and Christians alike who don't really respect philosophy. But for the most part, people respect science and philosophy. And so those are the ones that I really focus on as far as the arguments go. I can make a biblical case against abortion, and I have actually done talks at churches where I just use scripture and very little science or philosophy because they want to know like what the Bible teaches about it. So I can use Bible verses, especially if I'm talking to someone who brings them up. But for the most part, I just stick to science and philosophy because most people, the majority of people I talk to don't hold the Bible up as an authority, and they will most likely respect science and philosophy. But also, there's kind of a pro-choice caricature of pro-life people that we're just all, religious zealots who just go around beating people over the head with the Bible. And so the more we can focus on science and philosophy, the more we can try to fight back against this caricature that pro-choice people often make of pro-life people. Because
for example, Pete Buttigieg a couple months back, he actually tried to make a point that the Bible would be more in favor of a pro-choice positions, claiming that the life begins at birth, that the Bible claims that at some point. Have you encountered that much or positions like that?
Once in a while. That's not the most common because, or at least I hope most people can see how ridiculous that is. Obviously, Pete Buttigieg couldn't, but yeah, Adam was breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, but he was also created outside the womb. And so, if God makes a person, uh, on earth without putting them through the womb first, then yeah, they'll need the breath of life to become a living soul. That's because they're not being conceived the normal way for human beings. So, obviously life doesn't begin at first breath. Adam was just a special case because of how he was conceived. More common pro-choice objections I get, and I don't remember the references specifically offhand. One comes from Exodus and one comes from Numbers. One is the passage where two men are fighting. They accidentally hit a pregnant woman, and if she gives birth prematurely, you're to give life for life, or whatever the passage is. And then the other one is about the the test for adultery, that you put warm wood in water, and if she did commit adultery, she drinks the water, then her womb becomes barren, and if she doesn't, then she's not guilty of adultery. So those are really the two most common passages that I get from a pro-choice person. And if you want me to be a little more specific, I can grab my Bible and look it up. But those are kind of the gist of the two most common arguments from Scripture that I hear. I do occasionally encounter others, like Pete Buttigieg's life at first breath argument. But the Numbers and Exodus passages are definitely the most common that I hear.
Now, what about in favor of, say, pro-life? Can you, what would be the best example to go outside of, say, Psalm 139?
Right. Yeah. I don't think there are necessarily any specific scripture references I would point to, because you have Psalm 139, but that's a poetic way of describing conception in the womb. And then I don't usually like to go to Jeremiah 1:5 either, which of course is the verse where God says, "Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you." Because if we take that literally, then that seems to again support the preexistence of the soul. So I wouldn't point to that verse either, because I think that's a verse regarding God's foreknowledge, not that God literally knows someone before he forms him in the womb. So I really think we have to take Scripture as a whole, and if we take Scripture as a whole, we can see that that Christianity is pro-life. I mean, first of all, we have very early teaching from Christians that abortion and infanticide are immoral and should not be practiced, from the Didache, which is one of the oldest Christian texts which are not found in the Bible. But then, even though the pro-life position is not explicitly taught, it is implicit throughout Scripture, because number one, science has shown us that human life begins at fertilization. So when we read in the passages of the Ten Commandments in Exodus and Deuteronomy, we read, "You shall not murder." Well, if the unborn are one of us, well, then surely killing them. Also, there are passages in Psalms, such as is it like Psalm 51 or something, where David says, "For I was conceived in iniquity, in sin my mother conceived me." Well, at first blush, that may not seem like a very powerful verse, but that does indicate that David saw himself as himself when he was conceived. So that even though it doesn't explicitly teach it, it does imply a continuity of identity from conception. So we have various psalms like that where they talk about being conceived, and they see themselves as that individual that was conceived at the time. We also have other passages, where we have numerous passages about, where God says that that child sacrifice never even entered into his mind to command. We have other passages like Jesus talking about the kingdom of heaven, how it belongs to such as these, which are the children. So, we have numerous passages where God and Jesus were talking about how much they love children, and they suffer not the little ones to come to me. If you cause one of these little ones to sin, it would be better for you to tie a millstone around your neck and cast yourself into the Jordan River. Those kinds of passages, and then of course we have third trimester John the Baptist leaping in the womb, when first trimester Jesus came near to him. So we have a lot of passages in Scripture which seem to imply a pro-life position, not to mention the fact that Scripture makes no difference between a child inside the womb and a child outside the womb. In fact, the same Hebrew and Greek words for child are used in both situations. So So we have a lot of scriptures which seem to imply that abortion would be wrong, and we can just simply point to the fact that the Bible doesn't specifically teach that abortion is wrong, but that's really most likely because the ancient Jews were not aborting their children, and even the first Christians were not aborting their children because they saw children as a gift from God, and someone whose womb was barren was seen as cursed. So there really was no need to have any sort of law against abortion because they just were not aborting their children based on how they viewed children. So if I'm making a Christian case against abortion, my case is that we need to take scripture as a whole, not that there's necessarily one specific passage we can point to.
All right, well, guys, I have to get going, but Clinton, I really appreciated your presentation tonight, so thanks for doing that for us. It was great.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yes, I will see the rest of you guys.
I sent all of you the outline. If you didn't get it and you'd like a copy of it, just let me know. Covered pretty much all of it, but it's still very informative and a nice reference to have if you need to review what he said this evening. All right. Clinton, brother, greatly appreciate it. From the East Coast again, I give the same opportunity that Melissa and Devin do. So we're in the middle of buying a house that has plenty of room. So pick me up.
Okay, well, thank you. I appreciate that. Maybe one of these days I can go give a talk in person.
This is true. We have Frank coming back. We've had a few people come and speak at Marshall. The more we had visit, the lower the attendance became. So we're going to try it one more time. Frank being Frank Turk, had the largest attendance when he was here. So we're going to give him a shot one more time in October.
Yeah, and also I'd just like to point out that if anyone has any questions or just want to follow up with anything, they can feel free to hit me up. You can get my email through John. And this is kind of what I do vocationally, even though I don't really make a living at it. It's what I do, basically for what I spend a good chunk of my time doing. So you're never bothering me, emailing me a question or just want a follow up discussion or anything. So you can get my email through John if you'd like.
And friend him on Facebook. He does music too.
That's it. Yeah, I'm a musician. That's actually part of how I supplement my income as I do the professional musician thing. So.
Oh. He has a music room of stuff.
What's that?
He's got a whole music room of stuff: guitars and piano and
cool.
set and cajon and a whole bunch of instruments I've never heard of.
All right, I got a veritable one-man band there.
Yeah.
She's talking me up, but but thank you very much for your presentation.
Yeah, happy to do it. Thank you for attending.
Absolutely.
I'm out, brother. 9 o'clock our time.
I'm
going horizontal shortly.
Yeah. All right. Yep. No problem.
Thank you, brother.
Yeah. Thank you.